Jerusalem, the city of Islam. Today, I'm interviewing Paul Ellis on the origins of Islam, and in the Quran, the constant references to the house of God. And when we look at the Bible as its connections, we constantly see Jerusalem being the locale. Why is it that Muslims prayed in that direction, but then it changed? While the Muslim sources say Mecca, while others are arguing Petra as a source for Muhammad's journeys in the beginning, Jerusalem is the only place we have a coin. We have numismatic evidence supporting the case that early Islam started and was birthed from the city of Jerusalem. In this 25-part series with Paul Ellis, we're going to go through these arguments, supporting the case of Jerusalem playing a much more significant role in early Islam than what the Islamic tradition tells you.
Now move on to Safa and Marwa, and this one's slightly more involved, so if I go at a pace, it's because I want to finish this before sunset. Okay, the key verse here is Surah 2, verse 158. Truly Safa and Marwa are among the rituals of God, so whoever performs the Hajj to the house or makes the Umrah, there is no blame on him going to and fro between them. And whoever volunteers good, truly God is thankful, knowing. So this refers to people making the Hajj to the house, potentially going between two places, one called Safa and one called Marwa. Where are these places? The Islamic tradition has two rocky knolls, just a few yards from the Kaaba, where it is said that Hagar ran back and forth 7 times looking for water. There's no trace of this prior to the Quran, this tradition or these rocks having any particular significance. And I would say that that's an invention. Whoever established the Meccan shrine looked around for a way of incorporating Safa and Marwa, found these two rather convenient small hills and says, yeah, that one's Safa, that one's Marwa. Okay, look, what do they really mean? Marwa, I would say, is Mount Moriah. I think they're so similar as words that that's a reasonable inference. And Mount Moriah is so crucial to the story that the Quran constantly tells, the Bible story, that I think it has to be a very good candidate. Remember, Mount Moriah was the scene where God tested Abraham with the sacrifice of Isaac in Genesis chapter 22, a story that, as we've seen, is referred to in the Quran in Surah 2, verse 124, 129. It is also in biblical tradition, precisely on that spot where Abraham raised the knife to sacrifice his son, that Solomon later built or situated the Holy of Holies of the Jerusalem temple. And that's in 2 Chronicles chapter 3, verse 1. So that's Mount Moriah. I find that a very easy step to interpret. Safa, a little bit more challenging. I would claim this as a reference to a hill that's called Har Hatzofim, or in the more common, it's now more, if you look at an English language map of Jerusalem, it's now called Mount Scopus, which is a Greek word coming from the fact that it was originally called the Mount of the Watchmen, or Lookout Mountain. And if they don't sound particularly like Safa, this hill was referred to as Safa by the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus.
I can't help but why? Oh, no, you can go to the next image if you'd like. This is really interesting, though. I can't help but think that this can't be one person thinking this through. So when we talk about the Quran, this is why I'm interested in getting that book by Daniel Beck. It's quite expensive. I looked it up on Amazon. But the idea that the Quran is like one guy wrote all this down and is aware of all these sources this detailed. If it is one guy, he knows how to read and write. I can't imagine, or his staff that is around him are brilliant and they know where this stuff is at. I cannot picture an illiterate man who does not know anything from anything, never escaped Arabia, coming up with this stuff. This is just, that's why they want to say it's an angel Gabriel, but that just to me is
I would refer to the authorship of the Quran as genius. I regard it as one of the most impressive literary achievements of humankind. For somebody to write the first book in a language and to pack it in with this level of sophistication of literary references, textual references, and wordplay and puns and ingenious little twists. And the great injustice is that Muslims, or the Islamic tradition, gives these banal and simplistic answers at every opportunity. Where is Safa and Marwa? Oh, it's two hills, one called Safa and one called Marwa, and somebody used to run between the two. My favorite one is the blind man, Surah 80, where the blind man frowned and turned. He frowned and turned away when the blind man came to him, and the explanation is that the prophet was in the mosque one day, and a blind man came to him, and Muhammad frowned and turned away. This level of utterly banal and simplistic explanation for such a sophisticated book is really an injustice to the author and what he originally meant.
Yeah, and it makes me wonder if it's one author. And then there's the poetic sense of the text. But I wonder if it's multiple. Like some academics think that this is a work like by multiple people in it. I don't know. It's just, if not, I think that, like you said, the simplistic dumbing down of the reality of the text is just, it really is stilling the thunder of the text. Because I told this to Muslims and they talk about Angel Gabriel gave all this, and and I'm like, I'm finding Gnostic, stuff that's in Alexandria, Egypt, which is not too far from Arabia. Okay. And I'm thinking to myself, where are they coming up with these ideas of Jesus not being actually crucified? And I found precedents that's already existed within Christian tradition, even if it is Gnostic, that he didn't get actually crucified. And I'm thinking, well, if this is already something that's existing, what's more probable? A guy hiding in a cave who gets some type of revelation, or he's well aware of all of these traditions, or his group are aware, however you want to put it. That to me is more probable. Yeah. It makes the most sense, and it makes it more fun to me.
Yeah, the bits of Persian in there, particularly in relation to paradise and the images of paradise and Mithraism. There's bits of Ethiopic tradition in there. It's the guy, or whoever it was, whatever process led to the Quran, was fantastically erudite. And the notion that this is an illiterate guy is it does no justice to the text. It doesn't honor the Quran at all. Okay.
Thank you.
So what do I say about Safa by Josephus? Is it possible that this is just a coincidence? Well, let's have a look at what it is. It's a reference to Jerusalem as the eschatological landscape. So here you see modern day Jerusalem, and the Dome of the Rock is built around the natural summit of Mount Moriah. If you took away that great rectangular platform that's been built and added on by one person after another, and you take it all away, you would find a mountain underneath, which would have its summit exactly where the golden dome is built over it. And over way in the distance, you can see Mount Scopus, or in Hebrew known as Har HaSophim. Well, this passage in Josephus refers to Safa within the context of the conquest of Jerusalem by Alexander the Great. The Jews, this is obviously going back away, you probably know better than I do, is that 4th century BC, Alexander?
I believe it is. 4th, 5th century. Let me double check it. Well, go ahead. Keep going.
I'll keep going. A long way, a way back in the day. The Jews had refused to help Alexander, according to Josephus's recording of the tradition. The Jews had refused to help Alexander, and when his army approached, they were afraid that he was going to sack the city. So the high priest, called Jaddua, left the city in a great procession to ceremonially offer its surrender to Alexander at a place called Safa.
It was 4th century, just so we know. Okay.
And when he, that's Jaddua, the high priest, understood that he, meaning Alexander, was not far from the city, he went out in procession with the priests and the multitude of the citizens. The procession was venerable, and the manner of it different to that of other nations. It reached a place called Safa, which translated into Greek signifies a prospect. For you have thence a prospect both of Jerusalem and of the temple. So as you can see here, that's where it would be. You can just about see the temple in the distance from over there. And when the Phoenicians and the Chaldeans that followed Alexander thought that they would have liberty to plunder the city and torment the high priest to death, which the king's displeasure, that's Alexander's displeasure, fairly promised them, the very reverse of it happened. And this is where Josephus then goes on to portray Alexander as a righteous pagan who's very respectful of the Jewish tradition, and he actually leaves the temple alone. He doesn't plunder it and honors Jerusalem and so on. This is part of the incorporation of the figure of Alexander into the Judeo-Christian tradition. Now, Alexander appears in the Quran twice. In Surah 18, verse 60 to 64, we have the story of Moses and the fish. This must have puzzled, more than most parts of the Quran, this must have puzzled Muslims for centuries. Why on earth is the Quran telling them this strange story of Moses? He stops and his servants about to prepare a fish for them to eat. The fish comes alive, leaps out of his hand and swims away. What on earth does it mean? This is, in fact, a variant of a 3rd century Alexander romance of Pseudo-Callisthenes, but you didn't have to go that far. This is also referred to in the Babylonian Talmud and also in the homilies of Jacob of Saru, which incidentally also contain the story of the 7 sleepers of Ephesus, which also inspire a story in Surah 18 at the same time. So whoever was reading or whoever was composing Surah 18 was, I think, under the influence of Jacob of Saru primarily. Well, the story of Moses and the fish, the original story, is that Alexander is traveling the world seeking the font of eternal youth, and his servant Andreas wants to wash his fish in a river, and the fish leaps, becomes alive and swims away, as in the Quran story. And Andreas trips and in his attempt to recapture his dinner, falls into the water. Never tells Alexander about this incident until some time later, and then he recounts this odd story, and Alexander realizes that that was the font of immortality where they had camped, and they go back looking for it and they can never find it again. And this is a Christian allegory, because the idea is that the great ruler Alexander the Great misses out on salvation, whereas the humble servant, there's obviously a metaphor of baptism there, the humble servant gets immortality and his master doesn't.
If I may, just to make a funny, interesting connection to the Gilgamesh Epic, this is kind of another modern retelling of what happened with Gilgamesh, where he goes to Utnapishtim trying to seek immortality. He gets a plant, or he's told to take this plant, and the plant gets stole or taken by a serpent, and the serpent takes off with this plant, and he cannot live forever, which in the ancient world, when the serpents would peel their skin, they would renew their life, and they thought they lived forever. Just an ancient Near Eastern concept of snakes. But that's just, it makes me think of that. Much older, how these retellings are taking place. But the fish, we know that's Christ. We know that's Jesus.
Yep.
So the Quran knows this fish is clearly a symbol for Christ.
But if you don't understand this, just think of all those countless generations of Muslims reading this story and just scratching their heads saying, what's this about? We're so privileged now to have all of the internet and access to all this information. But the Quran is so rich, and this and it really does an injustice to it not to spot the allusions that his author clearly intends his readers to get.
Thank you.
Then, a few verses later, we have the story of Dul-Qarnain, the two-horned one, and this is a variant of a different legend of Alexander the Great. This time, it's the Syriac legend of Alexander, and this is more relevant, more important, because this is used by Heraclius to celebrate his victory over the Sasanian Empire in 628. In the Syriac legend, Alexander goes to the place of the rising of the sun and the place of the setting of the sun, and then he goes to another place where he builds a wall of iron and bronze to keep Gog and Magog at bay. And he says that when Gog and Magog break out, then that will be a sign that the end of the world is at hand. Well, Heraclius said that, yes, well, I am that's what's happened. He says the Sasanian Empire are Gog and Magog, and the prophecy has come to pass, and the end of the world is now at hand. And he says, I am now the last emperor before the last day. He says the time is running out, and I am the last virtuous emperor. And it's a very, very complicated story. You need to read Stephen Shoemaker's The Apocalypse of Empire, to where he explains all about the role of the last emperor and how the last emperor fits into this story. But there's no doubt that the story of Dul-Qarnain in the Quran is a retelling of the Syriac legend of Alexander the Great, and one can only assume that Muhammad is placing himself in the role of the last emperor, or trying to allude to the idea that he is the main person who's going to establish a righteous rule before the end of days.
I must add too that, just saying, in light of all of this, many Muslims early on, actually, for I think the first few centuries, were all unanimous in agreeing this was Alexander the Great. Dul-Qarnain was Alexander the Great. Then things started to change over apologetics, I think, start to set in, and they start finding ways, well, this is a problem with our modern conceptions. But
actually, I wouldn't go that far, because to me, this rather mysterious name, the two-horned one, seems to me deliberately ambiguous. I think that what he's trying to do is trying to conflate the story or the figure of Alexander with Moses, because as Moses has fulfilled the role of Alexander in verses 60 to 64 with the story of the fish, and because Moses was often depicted as having two horns, I think the way the two-horned one is an attempt to take the Alexander legend and project it onto a Moses-like figure. And then the Quran author himself explicitly describes himself as being a new Moses the new age.
Very interesting. That is a very clever way of putting it. Yeah.
There are layers and layers of this. And further layers, if you want another layer, is the Quran has many similarities with the book of Daniel in particular. And book of Daniel refers to Alexander the Great, who he depicts as a goat. So it's a complex, multi-layered illusion, I think.
Thank you.
Okay. So now I hope I've explained why what seems at the first glance to be a rather bizarre reference to Josephus and the account of the surrender of Jerusalem to Alexander the Great. If you have a vision of the Quran author or the Quranic community as being trying to capture Jerusalem, that is the place that they're heading towards, that's where it's all about. And of course, the place where they did actually capture in 638, then this reference to the surrender of Jerusalem to Alexander makes perfect sense. And if one assumes, and I think we must assume, that the Quran author is very familiar with Hebrew texts and with not actually Hebrew text, it would be a Greek text, but the works of Josephus, then I think the reference to Safa becomes a lot clearer than it might at first glance seem. So the name Safa, I would say, refers to the surrender of Jerusalem to Alexander the Great, who is the Del Qarnayn of Surah 18, 83 to 103. But there's more. There's a lot more. Let's go back to my little chart of Jerusalem as an eschatological landscape. You see over here, this area of high ground is the Mount of Olives. Mm-hmm. And the valley that separates Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives is the Kidron Valley. Well, in biblical tradition, the Messiah when he arrives, will arrive on the Mount of Olives, and the Kidron Valley will be the scene of the judgment of the enemies of Israel. If I refer to two biblical texts, the first is the book of Joel, chapter 3, verse 2. God, through the prophet Joel, says, "I will gather all nations and bring them down to the Valley of Jehoshaphat." That's the valley of God's judgment. "There I will put them on trial for what they did to my inheritance, my people Israel, because they scattered my people among the nations and divided up my land." So Joel has the situation of the judgment of the nations of the world in a valley that he refers to as the Valley of God's judgment, the Valley of Jehoshaphat. Now, tradition has it that that is the Kidron Valley, but we don't need any extra biblical tradition because it's in the Bible itself. The book of Zechariah, the prophet Zechariah, chapter 14 says, "Lo, a day shall come for the Lord when the spoils shall be divided in your midst. And I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem for battle. The city shall be taken, houses plundered, women's ravished, and half of the city shall go into exile. The rest of the people shall not be removed from the city. Then the Lord will go out to fight against those nations as he fights in the day of battle. On that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, east of Jerusalem, and the Mount of Olives will be split in two, from east to west, forming a great valley, with half of the mountains moving to the north and half to the south. And the valley of the Lord's mountain shall be filled up with the valley of those two mountains, reaches its edge. It shall be filled up as it was filled up by the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, the king of Judah. Then the Lord my God will come, and all the holy ones with him." So Zechariah is absolutely explicit that God's feet will stand upon the Mount of Olives east of Jerusalem, and he will then form a great valley. And because this uses the same terminology as Joel, it talks about gathering all the nations together for judgment, I think it's reasonable to say that this is the Valley of Jehoshaphat, which is, of course, what biblical tradition says. Now, how does the Quran deal with this? The Quran refers to a great plain. In Surah 18, again, back to Surah 18, 47 to 48, on the day we will set the mountains in motion, and you will see the earth an open plain, and we will gather them and leave not one of them behind. So he's talking about gathering the nations of the earth together for judgment at what the Quran refers to as the valley or the plain of Qiyamah. And Surah 20, verses 102, the day the trumpet shall be blown, and we shall gather the guilty on the day blind. They ask thee about the mountains. Say, my Lord shall scatter them as ashes, and he will leave it a barren plain. You will see no crookedness or curvature therein. So these two passages refer to the God creating a plain on the day of judgment for the day of judgment to take place, to assemble all those who are about to be judged. And this seems to me a clear adoption of the passages from Joel and Zechariah, the creation of a plain of judgment. And if it adopts the mechanism of flattening mountains or scattering mountains like ashes and creating a great plain of judgment, then I think you have to accept the location of that. And that would be the Kidron Valley would be the place where that happens. So the Kidron Valley, which is the Valley of Jehoshaphat in Judeo-Christian tradition, is also, I would say, the site of the future plain of Qiyamah on the last day of the Quran. But there's more even than that. To the south, we have the Valley of Hinnom, the Valley of Gehenna. Now, I think I've already spoiled the surprise on this, because Jesus refers 11 times to the Valley of Gehenna as symbolic of the destruction of the unrighteous, usually by fire. So I've got all the references here. Particularly, I would single out Matthew chapter 12, verse 28, when Jesus says, "Fear not them which kill the body, but are not able to kill the soul, but fear him who is able to destroy both body and soul in Gehenna." Or similarly in Mark 9:43, "If your hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life maimed than with two hands to go to Gehenna, where the fire never goes out." And as I think I mentioned right at the beginning of our interview, the word Jahannam is used in the Quran to refer to hell and the hellfire. In fact, it occurs 77 times in the Quran. In fact, more than that. There's another 30 times when it uses the word Jahim, which is probably a shortened form of it. But at least 77 times. And I think it is clear that Jahannam is an Arabicization of Gehenna, which is an Aramaic version of the Valley of Hinnom. So the Quran seems to accept the Jerusalem eschatological landscape. You have the Valley of Judgment in the Valley of Kidron, and you have the gateway to hell on the adjacent valley, the Valley of Hinnom, or the Valley of Jahannam.
Just a small little note about this that I find fascinating. Not only does Jesus mention Gehenna, which is, I like the way you're pointing out, this is what the Quran's discussing. He also talks about the judgment of the nations. So referring back to that previous point, it isn't just the Hebrew Bible that has this. Jesus himself in Matthew mentions something about the judgment of the nations. He doesn't give all of the geographical location that you see in Zechariah and what you mentioned in Joel. Mm-hmm. But I mean, when he's sitting on the Mount of Olives in Mark 13, Matthew 24, Luke 21, and he's saying, you see all these things, see this temple? Yeah, this is going down. And I think it's very apocalyptic. So, you know, I think they're harping on the same apocalyptic tone that you find within the biblical text.
Yeah, I'll move on to that, but we've got another couple of steps to go. Yes, this ritual of the red cow. Numbers chapter 19, Moses is instructed to sacrifice a red heifer that is free from every blemish and upon which no yoke has ever been laid. and Moses is instructed that this red cow should be led outside the camp and slaughtered in the presence of the high priest. And there's a certain complexity about why this is, which doesn't. I don't think we need to go into the details here, but there's a part of a wider ritual. Now, in the Mishnah Para, which is a commentary on the Torah, there is a passage in the Mishnah Para, one might add, is actually called the Mishnah of the cow. Apparently, para means cow, and in in chapter 3, verse 6, it describes the ritual as it used to be practiced in the days of the temple. It says they, particularly the Israelites, the Jews, they made, and there's a word that could be translated as a ramp, a bridge, or a causeway from the Temple Mount to the Mount of Olives, being constructed of arches above arches, each arch placed directly above each foundation as a protection against a grave in the depths below, whereby the priest who was to burn the cow itself, and all who aided in the preparation went forth to the Mount of Olives. So they built this viaduct over the valley, linking the temple directly with the Mount of Olives, so that you wouldn't step on any graves, and you'd walk in this exalted path, this pavement in the sky, from one place to the other, in order to carry out the ritual of the red cow. And there I've got a picture, again I've downloaded from the internet, of this ritual taking place. I should add that there is not a slightest shred of evidence to say that this structure ever existed, but that doesn't really affect my argument. It's the point that in the Jewish tradition, this structure is said to have existed,
right?
Or the very least, this route.
Yeah, and you got to ask yourself, well, where else is this tradition mentioned? We have it here in the Mishnah, so if the Quran is bringing it up, which I think you're going to get there, 1 + 1 = 2. Anyway.
Yep. So, and this is a ritual that is actually recalled in Surah 2 of the Quran, between verses 67 and 71. You may recall I set out Surah 2. It begins with the experience of mankind, and then moves on to a section of the infidelity, the perfidiousness of the Jews. And this, during the course of this, it refers to the Jews being deliberately obstructive concerning the sacrifice of the red cow, trying to find any reason, any excuse not to conduct the sacrifice, asking facetious questions about what type of cow it should be. And the second step is the eastern gate to the temple complex is, in the book of Ezekiel, said to be reserved for a figure which we assume is some sort of messianic figure that is described as the prince. In Ezekiel chapter 19, he, and we assume it is an angel, brought me, this is Ezekiel talking, back to the outer gate of the sanctuary, facing the east, but it was closed. He, that's the angel, said to me, "This gate is to remain closed. It is not to be opened for anyone to enter by it. Since the Lord, the God of Israel, has entered by it, it shall remain closed. Only the prince may sit down in it to eat his meal in the presence of the Lord. He must enter by way of the vestibule of the gate and leave by the same way." So we have the eastern gate of the Temple Mount, which is reserved specifically for the Messiah. And there is a very grand gateway that was constructed on the eastern side, called the Golden Gate, which is now all bricked up and can't use. Although I think the Waqf have tried to reopen it as a mosque, haven't they? And as you were referring to yourself, Christianity, or the gospel writers, not Christianity then really, but the gospel writers have adopted this idea of the Messiah entering Jerusalem from the east. So Jesus acquires a donkey to enter Jerusalem on Palm Sunday at a place called Bethphage on the Mount of Olives, and he spends his hours before his arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane. And both of these are on the Mount of Olives. And I would say that this is a suggestion that Jesus entered the temple from the east on those two occasions. At the end of the gospel story, Jesus ascends to heaven from the Mount of Olives, and the angels tell the apostles present at the scene that he will return to them just as you saw him go up, which is traditionally understood that Jesus will return to the Mount of Olives. He ascends from the Mount of Olives and he will return to earth from the same place, thereby completing the prophecy of Ezekiel. So you have this eschatological importance of the Mount of Olives, and the idea of particularly of traveling between the Mount of Olives and the Jerusalem temple and the Temple Mount and the Jerusalem proper. So there I built a little viaduct there for my Kidron Valley. And I've also got Jesus on his donkey heading across the Kidron Valley there. So, is it possible that this is a coincidence? For Surah 2's verse 248, Safa and Marwa not to be Jerusalem, it requires the following facts to be explained away as a coincidence. That Jerusalem includes two places, one of which sounds remarkably similar to Marwa, the other once known as Safa. That these two place names, they aren't just two individual place names, one called Safa and one called Marwa, but they are similar geographical features. They are both hills and they are virtually adjacent to one another. And I wonder, could you find a place called Safa and a place called Marwa in London or Paris or New York or any other city? It's quite a remarkable coincidence to find two places, a Safa and a Marwa, but to find them as similar features next to each other, I think is a heck of a coincidence. That Jerusalem just happens to be the central location of the Bible narrative, associated with many of the Quran's key biblical figures and stories, as I have mentioned. So it's not just anywhere. It's not London or Paris or New York. It's Jerusalem, the place that the Quran talks about and that all the people that it talks about would regard as the center. That each of these sites has an independent significance to passages of the Quran. Moriah as the traditional location of the testing of Abraham and the site of the temple, Safa as a place where Jerusalem was surrendered to Alexander the Great. More than that, it's not just that we've got a Safa and we've got a Marwa, we've also got the idea that moving between the two, which is what the Quran verse refers to. It doesn't refer to Safa and Marwa alone. It talks about moving between the two. Moving between the two involves crossing the Kidron Valley, where the biblical tradition states that the great plain of judgment, which is referred to in the Quran, will be created on the last day. And that this will be following the route taken by the high priest to carry the sacrifice of the red cow, a ritual that is referred to in the Quran in a surah called the cow, and the route that Ezekiel has foretold that the Messiah would take, and which the Gospels imply that Jesus took. One has to accept that all of this is just a series of bizarre coincidences, and in fact, Safa and Marwa refer to two completely nondescript rocks deep in the Hijaz, that if they weren't brought into service to explain this verse, would probably never have been given any name at all.
quick question I'd like to ask you is, when did that tradition of the rocks down there in the Hijaz actually be, pointed to, and when is the earliest we can say that they made those claims?
Good question.
Yeah, and if you don't know, these are good questions. Yeah.
Can we go throw it out to the audience? Really, if anyone wants to put a post on, I'd love a question I'd like is the earliest secure reference to Mecca in Hijaz. There are various occasions where Mecca is where the word Mecca is referred to, for example, in the Byzantine Chronicle, and the various hints that there might be something going on down there. You've got the inscription that talks about the building of the Kaaba in 696, isn't it? And you've got inscriptions between Taif and Mecca that suggest that people were going backward and forward. But what is the first solid reference to somebody saying, right, I'm going off and making my pilgrimage now to Mecca. I'm going to be some time because it's located down in the Hijaz. I wonder what the first reference to that is. It's certainly not going to be before the Abbasid revolution. I wonder when the first is.
Yeah, and I have a problem too, just looking at this little map right here to give you an example. Me and my buddy Umar were going through this, and so you have the Taif over here on the right side I pointed to, and this is a side angle to show you the mountaintops to get to Mecca, unless there's like a narrow passageway. Here's another one from the top to kind of give you an idea of these mountain ranges between both where modern Mecca, where we would say Mecca is, and Taif, which I think would be...
So just to interrupt, I can't see what you're showing because I'm sharing my screen.
Oh, okay.
Should I stop sharing?
No. We don't want to mess that up. I just showing the audience. There's a mountain peak here. How do camels get through this? This is just, they'll be able to see this and go, what the heck? So there's a lot of questions. The point is we have more questions than answers. And when we are looking at these earliest dates, I'm interested in knowing when's the first time they said, hey, these two little mountains down here in Arabia are really these, what we're talking about with Moriah or Safa and Marwa. So good questions. And
who came with these names either? I mean, if in the story, the traditional Islamic narrative, you've got Abraham taking Hagar down into the Hijaz, leaving them at the point where the Kaaba now is, and Abraham gives them some water and says, good luck, and he disappears. They run out of water. They obviously haven't moved very far, and so they're then going, Hagar is running backwards and forwards 7 times between these two sites. Now, the obvious point is, if you run out of water, what's the point of running backwards and forwards 7 times? How is that going to help your situation? It's reasonable to check both sides for water. It's reasonable to go back and double check to make sure you haven't missed anything. But 7 times, it makes no sense. But more than that, let's suppose that was the case. Who then calls these 2 hills Safa and Marwa? What do those names mean? Who said, I'm going to call it Safa because, and I'm going to call this one Marwa because? I don't see any explanation there.
Yeah.
It's just 2 random words in the Quran.
Great points. Really good points.